I've been doing this car review gig for a little while now, and it's not very often that I'm genuinely surprised by a car. Generally speaking, my impressions of a car going into the test drive usually line up more or less with reality, but sometimes a car really throws me for a loop. That's exactly what happened with this car, the all-new BYD Han. I genuinely did not expect to be discussing a car today that delivers this level of performance, luxury, and comfort, but here we are, so let's get started.
I can't help but compare the Han to the last BYD that I drove, the BYD Han. If you haven't seen that video already, I suggest you take a moment to watch it because I'm going to be comparing the two cars quite a bit. Throughout this review, I also want you to keep in mind that this Han costs only about $40,000.
I recall describing the styling of the BYD Han as being more or less the same as other large SUVs in its class, if a bit more handsome. That is not how I feel about the BYD Han. I think the BYD Han looks fantastic, starting here at this front fascia, which somehow manages to be mean, elegant, and futuristic all at the same time. There is a gas version of this car that has a traditional grille, and I think that it suffers because of that. Now, I'm not someone who's especially smitten with electric car designs all the time, but this one really just does it for me. One other small detail, here on the front, this badge is actually the Chinese character for this car's name, Han.
My enthusiasm for the Han's design only grows as we travel around the car. The side profile is also striking, with a very strong beltline and well-defined wheel arches front and rear. This car is all-wheel drive, but if you told me this was a rear-wheel drive car, I'd believe you. Plus, I love that silver element between the C and D pillar. It looks eye-catching without being garish. All this combines with a front fascia to give this car an athletic stance that I really enjoy.
Just wanted to point out that on the side here, you're going to see a lot of writing, especially in Chinese. That's because this car was borrowed from a BYD dealership here in Shanghai. This is actually a test drive car. So we are far from the only person that's been able to drive it, but we are one of the few people that's been able to actually test it.
The rear design isn't quite as inspired, but it's still a nice thing to drive behind in traffic. I'm especially fond of the rear taillight design, and I actually prefer a color where they pop a bit more, like black or dark blue. One little complaint I have is BYD's continued insistence on writing out "Build Your Dreams" on the tailgate of all their cars. This, of course, is what BYD stands for, but I have to say, please stop. I haven't seen this many characters written on a car since those stickers that Japanese manufacturers would use in the 1980s. It's a good font at least, but there's still no excuse for having this many letters on the back of your car.
One last thing before I stop talking about the rear end design, I wanted to point out this little badge here. Those of you who have seen my review of the BYD Han will know exactly what that means and will understand why I am so excited for the driving portion of this video. When it came to the interior of the BYD Han, I found it perfectly acceptable for its class. The only standout feature being the large center screen that could go from landscape to portrait and back. I think that the Han, in addition to keeping that very cool feature, surrounds it with a much more interesting design. From the adjustable lighting on the dash, to the sleek air vents, to the sleek design of this center console here and shift lever, it has a lot more character than the BYD Han did. The red interior on this particular car is also pretty fantastic. One thing about the interior is that it is a much more traditional design than a car like a Tesla, for example. But I think that's going to appeal to a certain subset of buyers, especially here in China. But the cool lighting and the big screen and the cool vents are not my favorite thing about this car. My favorite thing is in here. Yes, this is a Bluetooth microphone, which means that you can do karaoke inside of this car.
Now, at this point, I would love to serenade all of you with one of my favorite 80s power ballads, but unfortunately, doing that would get us taken off of YouTube with a quickness. So you're just gonna have to watch my performance and imagine what it would sound like. I'll tell you now, it's amazing. You don't realize quite how big the Han is until you sit here in the back seat. Legroom is impressive, and backseat passengers can enjoy some pretty great features, including reclining seats. You can also control a ton of the car's features using the screen on the center armrest, including everything from the air conditioning to the adjustable lighting.
Sitting back here, you might just forget that this car goes 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds. Oh, silly me. Did I fail to mention that this car has 2 electric motors pumping out 500 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque? Yeah, sorry about that. Though you probably saw it in the title anyway, so I think you can forgive me. This thing is quick. Very quick. The kind of quick where you need to double-check the distance between you and the car in front of you before you hit the accelerator pedal, because it just swallows space in huge gulps.
Despite all that power, BYD claims the Han will get about 350 miles of range according to the NEDC testing standard. Now, I'd take that number with about a metric ton of salt, as the NEDC has been replaced by the far more realistic WTLP testing standard at this point. It's hard to know what it would get into real-world conditions, but I guess it's significantly lower than 350 miles. Figure somewhere between 275 and 300 though, and that's still pretty impressive.
That 3.9 seconds 0 to 60 is a full second faster than the Tang, but in addition to that, this car actually has decent steering. I describe the steering in the BYD Tang as being something like a 80s video game. And while we're not talking about Lotus levels of precision and feedback when it comes to the Han, I can say it is leaps and bounds better than the BYD Tang. BYD also says that this thing will stop from 100 kilometers an hour, about 62 miles per hour, to 0 in only 104 feet, thanks to some big Brembos front and rear. That's a pretty impressive stopping distance for a 4,200 pound vehicle. Now, that weight is actually perhaps a little bit beneficial when it comes to the ride of this car, which is actually quite nice. It doesn't ride on huge 20-inch wheels like the Tang, which helps, and as a result, it goes over speed bumps and potholes quite well. Now, what isn't helped by weight is handling in general, and I wouldn't say that this car wallows through corners or anything. Its body control is actually pretty impressive, but it also isn't flickable. The thing is, though, that doesn't matter, because the real stars here are these electric motors, which are incredibly addictive. My producer was getting very mad at me because when we were doing car-to-car filming, I couldn't help but hit the accelerator pedal every single chance I get. So this video is going to be full of footage of me driving away from our film car as opposed to next to it. If you ask me, surprises are what makes life worth living. When I drive a cheap sedan, I expect it to drive like a cheap sedan. When I drive a Porsche, I expect it to drive like a Porsche. When they threw me the keys to this car, I expected it to drive like a BYD Tang, except a sedan. Sure, I knew it was supposed to be a little bit quicker, but I genuinely did not expect the all-around package that this car delivers. That is the kind of surprise that keeps me loving this gig. Thank you for watching.